Inside the final hours of Clayton Lockett. At 5:20 p.m. on April 29, 2014, a man walked into a death chamber in Oklahoma. White walls surrounded a gurney positioned in the center, a microphone suspended above for his final words. Behind the wall, 3 hooded executioners waded through 2 baseball-sized holes where IV lines would pass through. His name was Clayton Lockett, and he was scheduled to die at 6:12 p.m. But finding a vein became a problem. The paramedic tried twice on his left arm. Both attempts failed. Minutes passed. The tension grew. Then Lockett, despite resisting execution all morning, said something that still haunts those who heard it. "I've got a vein in my leg, my right leg." He was helping them kill him. What happened next would take 43 minutes instead of the usual 6 to 12. It would spark a nationwide debate, change execution protocols, and force America to ask an uncomfortable question. When does justice cross the line into something else? Before we go further, subscribe. We're covering cases that ask hard questions about crime and justice. To understand what happened in that execution chamber, we need to go back to the beginning. Clayton Darrell Lockett was born in 1975. By the time he turned 16 in 1992, he'd already started down a criminal path. That year, he pleaded guilty in Kay County to burglary and knowingly concealing stolen property, crimes that earned him a 7-year prison sentence. He also pleaded no contest to 2 counts of intimidating state witnesses, showing early on that he understood how to use fear as a weapon. But what happened to him in prison at 16 would complicate his story in ways no one could have predicted. Lockett was sent to the Oklahoma State Penitentiary, a facility designed for adult inmates, not juveniles. There, 3 adult male prisoners gang-raped him. A child, housed with grown men, became a victim of the same kind of violence he would later inflict on others. Does that trauma explain what came later? Does it excuse it? Or does it just make the whole thing harder to process? Those questions don't have easy answers. What we know is that after his release, Lockett's pattern of violence didn't stop, it escalated. Witness intimidation, threats, a growing willingness to hurt people who got in his way. By 1999, Clayton Lockett was 23 years old. He'd spent years building a reputation as someone you didn't cross. But nothing in his past, not the crimes, not the prison assault, not the years of intimidation, could prepare anyone for what came next. On a June evening in 1999, Lockett made a choice that would end a young woman's life, destroy multiple families, and eventually lead him back to that white-walled room 15 years later. Can trauma explain evil, or does it just complicate how we judge it? That question haunted this case from the beginning, because Clayton Lockett was both a victim and a perpetrator. Both things were true, and neither one canceled out the other. June 3, 1999. Perry, Oklahoma. Just after 10:30 p.m., 23-year-old Bobby Bornt was asleep on his couch, his 9-month-old baby sleeping in a nearby room. A loud crash jolted him awake. Someone had just kicked in his front door. 3 men burst into the house. Clayton Lockett, who Bobby recognized as the tattoo artist who'd recently worked on him, held a shotgun. With him were 26-year-old Sean Mathis and Lockett's 17-year-old cousin, Alfonso Lockett. What started as a brutal beating, Lockett striking Bobby repeatedly with the shotgun, quickly escalated into something worse. They bound Bobby's hands behind his back with duct tape, gagged him, and left him on the couch while they ransacked the house looking for drugs. But Bobby wasn't alone that night. 19-year-old Stephanie Neiman was also in the house. She was a recent high school graduate, a friend who'd come to visit. There was also Summer Hare and Bobby's infant son. All of them became captives. During the invasion, Lockett raped one of the victims, Neiman's friend. The violence wasn't random. It was calculated, deliberate. After terrorizing everyone in the house, the three men forced their captives into vehicles. Bobby Bornt, his baby, Summer Hare, and Stephanie Neiman were all driven to a remote area outside of town. That's where everything changed. Stephanie, despite the terror of the moment, did something brave. When the men discussed releasing them, she refused to promise she wouldn't go to the police. She wouldn't lie. She wouldn't give them that assurance. It was an act of courage. It was also her death sentence. Lockett used duct tape to bind her hands and cover her mouth. He walked her into a ravine, had his accomplices help her over a barbed wire fence. From approximately 6 feet away, he fired his sawed-off 12-gauge shotgun loaded with a quarter-ounce slug. The shot tore into her chest and shoulder, knocking her to the ground, but the gun jammed. Stephanie Neiman was still alive. Lockett walked back to his vehicle, used a screwdriver to unjam the shotgun, then walked back to where she lay bleeding. From about 2 feet away, he shot her again in the chest. That shot also wasn't fatal. She was still breathing, still conscious, still fighting. Lockett looked at her and said, "I ain't going to shoot her again." Instead, he told his accomplices to bury her, alive. They covered Stephanie Neiman with dirt while she struggled, while she fought for breath, while her life slipped away in that shallow grave. She died from her wounds, not instantly, but slowly, buried in the earth. Bobby Bornt, Summer Hare, and the infant were driven back to Bobby's house. The men warned them. If they told anyone, they'd be killed too. Then they were released. Stephanie Neiman's last moments were filled with courage and terror. She was 19 years old, a recent graduate with her whole life ahead of her. She'd done nothing except refuse to promise silence to men who'd already proven they were capable of unspeakable violence. If stories like this remind you why we need to remember victims' names, leave a comment below. Say her name, Stephanie Neiman. The next day, June 4th, 1999, Bobby Bornt and Summer Hare made a choice that took more courage than most of us will ever need. Despite the death threats, despite the terror still fresh in their minds, they walked into the Perry Police Department and told Detective Lieutenant David Farrow everything. What had happened, where it happened, who did it. Their testimony gave investigators the starting point they needed. Within hours, law enforcement began working the case. They recovered Stephanie Neiman's pickup truck. They found her body at the remote farm location where Bobby and Summer had described. And they started building a case. Detective Farrow's investigation was meticulous. By the time he finished, he'd uncovered approximately 86 individual pieces of evidence. Each one told part of the story. The 12-gauge shotgun used in the murder, hidden inside a box spring mattress in a garage behind a house where Lockett had been staying. DNA from Stephanie Neiman. Fingerprints lifted from the duct tape used to bind the victim's hands and mouths. Eyewitness testimony from Bobby and Summer, who could identify all three attackers. The forensic evidence didn't just suggest what happened, it confirmed it. That same day, June 4th, Detective Farrow arrested all three men in Enid, Oklahoma. Clayton Lockett, his 17-year-old cousin Alfonso Veazey Lockett, and 26-year-old Sean Mathis were found at a convenience store on South Van Buren Street. When confronted with the mountain of evidence, the shotgun, the DNA, the fingerprints, the witnesses who'd survived and spoken up, Clayton Lockett confessed. He admitted his role in the kidnapping, the rape, the murder. His confession, combined with everything Detective Farrow had collected, created a case that left no room for reasonable doubt. The survivors had been brave enough to speak. The investigators had been thorough enough to listen and follow the evidence wherever it led. And now, justice had a path forward. The evidence was overwhelming. But the legal process was just beginning. The state of Oklahoma charged Clayton Darrell Lockett in the District Court of Noble County, case number CF 9953. The charges were extensive: conspiracy, first-degree burglary, assault with a dangerous weapon, forcible oral sodomy, first-degree rape, kidnapping, robbery by force and fear, and first-degree murder. 19 counts total. At his 1999 trial, prosecutors presented the comprehensive case Detective Farrow had built. The 86 pieces of evidence told a story no defense attorney could counter. The 12-gauge shotgun hidden in a box spring mattress, DNA evidence from Stephanie Neiman, fingerprints on the duct tape used to bind the victims, eyewitness testimony from Bobby Bornt and Summer Hare, and Lockett's own confession. The facts of the crime itself weighed heavily in the courtroom. This wasn't just murder, it was kidnapping, rape, and the conscious burial of a living victim. Stephanie Neiman had been shot twice at close range, then buried while she still breathed. The jury heard all of it. They found Clayton Lockett guilty on all 19 counts. For the murder charge alone, the state presented 5 aggravating circumstances to justify the death penalty. The jury agreed with each one. They recommended death. The judge accepted their recommendation. On count 19, first-degree murder, Clayton Lockett was formally sentenced to death. For the other 18 counts, he received sentences ranging from 90 days to 300 years, all to be served consecutively. Not that those sentences mattered anymore. Lockett's defense team appealed the conviction. In 2002, the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals upheld both the conviction and the death sentence. Every legal challenge failed. The appeals process would continue for years, as it does in all capital cases, but the outcome never changed. 15 years would pass between sentence and execution. 15 years of legal motions, of waiting on death row, of appeals that went nowhere. 15 years Stephanie Neiman would never have. She'd been 19 when she died. By the time her killer faced his own death in 2014, she would have been 34. She might have had a career, a family, grandchildren for her parents to hold. Instead, she had a grave. Between 1999 and 2014, Clayton Lockett lived on death row at Oklahoma State Penitentiary. Records show little about any transformation during those 15 years. No spiritual awakening, no extensive legal scholarship, just the standard routines of confinement while appeals work their way through the courts. But in early 2014, something changed. Oklahoma's supply of pentobarbital, the standard execution drug, was running out. Mike Oakley, the general counsel for the Oklahoma Department of Corrections, scrambled to find replacement drugs. He had no medical training, but he was under pressure from officials facing elections who worried about appearing soft on crime. Oklahoma decided on a new 3-drug cocktail that had never been used before in American executions, and they refused to disclose where the drugs came from. Lockett and fellow death row inmate Charles Warner sued. They challenged Oklahoma's secrecy law, arguing they had a right to know what chemicals would be used to kill them. A state judge, Patricia Parrish, agreed. The law was unconstitutional. The Oklahoma Supreme Court granted a stay of execution to consider the case. Then Governor Mary Fallin did something unprecedented. She issued a statement declaring that the court had no authority to grant such a stay. Her Republican allies in the legislature started impeachment proceedings against the justices who tried to delay the execution. A constitutional crisis was unfolding. The executive branch was openly defying the judicial branch. The stay was eventually lifted under political pressure. The executions were scheduled. Clayton Lockett at 6 p.m. on April 29, 2014. Charles Warner at 8 p.m. the same evening. This political battle set the stage for April 29, 2014. What's your take on execution drug secrecy? Should states disclose these details? Let me know in the comments. Tuesday morning began with resistance. When prison staff arrived at Clayton Lockett's cell for routine pre-execution procedures, he refused to cooperate. He wouldn't allow them to restrain him for transport to the medical examination room. Guards deployed a taser, the electric shock forcing compliance where words had failed. They escorted him to a room for an X-ray exam, standard protocol. That's when medical personnel discovered the cut on his right arm, self-inflicted. Staff examined the wound and determined stitches weren't necessary, but the message was clear. Lockett was unraveling. Sometime before the execution, Lockett had submitted his final meal request through the required 30-day information packet. He'd asked for Chateaubriand steak cooked medium rare, shrimp with cocktail sauce, a baked potato with butter and sour cream, 6 slices of garlic toast, pecan pie, and a liter of Coca-Cola Classic. Prison officials rejected the request. It exceeded Oklahoma's $15 limit for final meals. Lockett's response: he refused to eat anything. Food trays came to his cell twice that day. Both times he turned them away. He also refused visits from his attorneys. The hours passed. At 5:20 p.m., 11 hours after being tasered, a 5-member strap-down team arrived at his cell. They escorted Clayton Lockett from death row to the execution chamber. The room waited for him. White walls, stark and clinical. A polished floor that reflected the overhead lights. In the center, a gurney, padded but unforgiving. Above it, a microphone suspended from the ceiling for any final words. 2 baseball-sized holes had been drilled through one wall, allowing IV lines to pass into an adjacent chemical room where 3 executioners stood, faces hidden behind hoods. They would administer the drugs without seeing the man they were killing. When asked if he had any last words, Lockett declined. At 5:26 p.m., his belt was secured to the gurney. The straps tightened across his chest, arms, legs. Behind beige blinds, witnesses began filing into the viewing area. Stephanie Neiman's family members took their seats. Media representatives, prison officials, all of them separated from the condemned by glass and fabric. The execution was scheduled to begin at 6 p.m. The room held a particular kind of silence. Not peaceful, but weighted. The air conditioning hummed. Someone coughed in the witness area. Lockett lay motionless on the gurney, waiting. No one knew yet that the preparation process would take far longer than anticipated. No one knew that what was about to happen would make international headlines. No one knew that this execution would spark a nationwide debate about lethal injection protocols. They just waited. The clock moved toward 6 p.m. The problem started immediately. A paramedic approached the gurney with an IV needle, searching for a vein in Lockett's left arm. The first attempt failed. He tried again, failed again. A phlebotomist, someone specifically trained to draw blood, was called in. They examined Lockett's arms, legs, and feet, searching for any viable entry point. Nothing worked. Minutes ticked by. Then, in a moment that still defies comprehension, Clayton Lockett, the same man who'd resisted all morning, who'd been tasered twice, who'd cut his own arm, spoke up. "I've got a vein in my leg, my right leg." He was helping them kill him. He admitted he'd intentionally dehydrated himself in the days leading up to the execution, but insisted he still had some viable veins they could use. The condemned man, volunteering his body as a roadmap to his own death. A doctor examined Lockett's neck and groin area. Prison staff brought a sheet to block the witness's view. The medical team made their decision. They would use a vein in his groin. They didn't have a needle of the proper size. They didn't have the right tape to secure the IV line properly. But they proceeded anyway. This was the first time Oklahoma had used this particular 3-drug cocktail. The dosages had never been tried in American executions before. 6:23 p.m. Warden Anita Trammell began the execution. The first drug, 100 milligrams of midazolam, a sedative, flowed through the IV line. 6:33 p.m. A doctor checked Lockett for consciousness. He was declared unconscious. The next two drugs were administered: vecuronium bromide, a paralytic that stops breathing, and potassium chloride, which stops the heart. By 6:33, all three drugs had been delivered. The execution should have been over. But Lockett started to writhe. He tried to lift his head. His body moved against the restraints. He began to speak. 6:42 p.m. Prison officials lowered the shades to the witness room. The phlebotomist and doctor rushed to check the IV. A lawyer for Lockett who witnessed the execution would later say, "It looked like torture." 6:44 p.m. The doctor discovered the vein had collapsed. The drugs had either absorbed into surrounding tissue, leaked out, or both. They weren't entering Lockett's bloodstream. Warden Trammell called Director Robert Patton. Patton asked the critical questions. "Has enough of the drugs been administered to cause death?" The doctor replied, "No." "Is another vein available to complete the execution?" "No." "Are there enough drugs left?" "No." Lockett still had a faint heartbeat. He was unconscious, but he was alive. 6:56 p.m. Robert Patton made a decision no corrections director in modern American history had made before. Under authority granted by the governor, he called off the execution. Prison officials reportedly discussed taking Lockett to a hospital. They didn't. 7:06 p.m. Clayton Lockett was declared dead from a massive heart attack. 10 minutes after the execution was halted. 43 minutes after the first drug was administered. No life-saving measures were given. According to the Oklahoma Department of Corrections, the average time for an inmate to be pronounced dead in the previous 19 executions had been 6 to 12 minutes. This took 43. In the witness room, Stephanie Nyman's family had watched it all unfold. They'd come expecting closure. Instead, they witnessed something no one had anticipated. At 8:00 p.m., Charles Warner was supposed to be led into that same chamber for his scheduled execution. Director Patton postponed it indefinitely. Something had gone catastrophically wrong, and the whole world was about to find out Charles Warner had been waiting in a holding cell for his 8 p.m. execution, scheduled in the same chamber, using the same drug protocol. Director Patton postponed it immediately. Warner would receive a 14-day stay. He'd eventually be executed 9 months later, on January 15, 2015. But that night, everything stopped. Governor Mary Fallin requested a full review of the execution process. Patton went further in his recommendations to the governor. Conduct a complete review of execution protocols, indefinitely suspend all executions, and launch a thorough investigation into what went wrong. When the investigation findings were released, they confirmed what witnesses had already suspected. The viability of the IV access point was the single greatest factor that contributed to the difficulty in the execution. The documents revealed chaos, a medical team without properly sized needles, staff struggling to find usable veins for nearly an hour, untested drug protocols at dosages never before tried in American executions, improper tape that couldn't secure the IV line. The case exploded internationally. President Barack Obama called Lockett's execution deeply disturbing and ordered Attorney General Eric Holder to review federal execution policies. The White House said it fell short of humane standards. Human rights organizations condemned what had happened. Ryan Kiesel of the ACLU of Oklahoma said the state had used a science experiment to cause a man to die in pain over more than 40 minutes. Human Rights Watch called it state-sanctioned torture. Defense attorneys demanded transparency. Madeline Cohen, Warner's lawyer who'd witnessed the execution, stated bluntly, "Clayton Lockett was tortured to death." The uncomfortable question hung in the air: when does justice become cruelty? But while the legal and political debate raged over drug protocols and constitutional rights, one name deserved to remain at the center of the conversation: Stephanie Nyman. She was 19 when Clayton Lockett killed her. She'd shown courage in her final moments by refusing to promise silence, and her family had attended that execution hoping for closure. They witnessed something else entirely. This case is still shaping how America views capital punishment. If this made you think differently, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that challenge us. Clayton Lockett's case forces us to hold two truths at once. He committed a brutal crime that deserved accountability. Stephanie Nyman's death was horrific, senseless, cruel. Her family deserved justice, but the system designed to deliver that justice failed catastrophically. What happened in that execution chamber raised questions about our methods, our protocols, our humanity. These stories matter not because they're entertaining, but because they teach us something about the systems we've built and the consequences when those systems break down. They remind us that real lives, victims and perpetrators, exist at the center of these debates. If you know someone interested in true crime stories that go deeper than the headlines, share this video with them. Turn on notifications. We're covering more cases that challenge how we think about crime, punishment, and justice. Next time, we'll examine another case where the line between justice and vengeance blurred. But for now, remember the name that should have always been first: Stephanie Nyman.